When survival hangs by a thread on the wild Texas frontier, one unexpected alliance changes everything. But some secrets, once revealed, could alter their fate forever. Thank you so much for watching and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you liked the story, and where you're watching from and why you're following this. The harsh winter wind whistled through the gaps in Margaret Wilson's cabin as she rocked her infant daughter, Sarah, trying to soothe her cries. The Texas frontier of 1847 showed no mercy to anyone, especially not to a widow with 2 young children. Her husband Thomas had been killed 3 months earlier in a hunting accident, leaving her alone with 5-year-old James and their newborn. "Hush now, little one," Margaret whispered, her voice cracking with exhaustion. Despite her efforts, Sarah continued to cry, her tiny face red with hunger. Margaret's milk had been dwindling for weeks, the stress and poor nutrition taking their toll. Outside, James attempted to chop wood, the axe far too heavy for his small frame. Margaret watched him through the window, her heart breaking. The boy had tried so hard to be the man of the house since his father's passing. "James, come inside now," she called, setting the crying baby in her cradle. "The wind's picking up. We'll finish the wood later." "But Pa always said we need to keep the fire going," James protested, his determined little face pinched with cold. "I know, sweetheart. You've done enough for now." As they stepped inside, Margaret noticed riders approaching in the distance. Her heart raced as she reached for Thomas's old rifle, though she barely knew how to use it. Living on the edge of Comanche territory meant constant vigilance. 3 Comanche warriors on horseback stopped at a respectful distance from the cabin. The leader, a tall man with a weathered face marked with battle scars, raised his hand in greeting. To Margaret's surprise, he spoke in halting English. "I am Running Elk of the Penateca Band. We come in peace." Margaret stepped cautiously onto the porch, keeping James behind her. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Running Elk dismounted and approached slowly. "I know of your husband's passing. The spirits told me of a woman alone with young ones." Margaret tightened her grip on the rifle. "We're managing fine." Running Elk's eyes softened as he heard the baby's cries from inside. "Your child needs milk. Your boy needs to learn to hunt. Winter is harsh and game is scarce." "What concern is that of yours?" Margaret asked, although deep down she knew he spoke the truth. Their supplies were dwindling, and she had no idea how they would survive until spring. "I lost my wife to fever 2 moons ago," Running Elk explained, his voice heavy with grief. "My daughter, little Fawn, needs a mother's milk. She grows weak." Margaret's maternal instinct stirred at his words. "You have a baby?" Running Elk nodded, gesturing to a small bundle carried by one of his companions. "Little Fawn has seen 4 moons. My sister tried to feed her, but she has returned to her husband's village." For a long moment, only the wind spoke as Margaret contemplated the warrior's words. James tugged at her skirt. "Ma, the baby's still crying." Inside, Sarah's wails grew more desperate. Margaret made a decision that would change all their lives. "Come inside, out of the cold. We can talk." The warriors exchanged glances, clearly surprised by the invitation. Running Elk nodded respectfully and followed Margaret into the cabin, while his companions remained outside with the horses. In the dim light of the cabin, Running Elk unwrapped the bundle to reveal a tiny baby girl with copper skin and dark, questioning eyes. Unlike Sarah's constant crying, little Fawn made only soft whimpering sounds, too weak to protest loudly. "She needs strength," Running Elk said simply. "You need food and protection. Your son needs to learn the ways of men." Margaret looked from her own hungry baby to the Comanche infant. In that moment, she saw not enemies or strangers, but 2 children in need. "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked. "I will teach your son to hunt. I will bring meat for your table. You will feed my daughter alongside your own. When spring comes, we will decide what is best." James, who had been silently observing, suddenly spoke up. "Will you teach me to shoot a bow like the Comanche?" Running Elk's stern face softened slightly. "Yes, little warrior. And to track deer, to move silently through forest, to read the sky and land." Margaret considered the offer, weighing their dire situation against the unprecedented arrangement. Trust did not come easily on the frontier, especially between settlers and Comanche. Yet survival sometimes required unlikely alliances. How do I know I can trust you? She asked directly. Running. Elk reached slowly into his pouch and withdrew a silver pocket watch that Margaret recognized with a gasp. Your husband saved my life 2 winters ago when I was wounded. He showed mercy when others would not. He spoke of his family with great pride. Tears welled in Margaret's eyes as she took the watch, Thomas's prized possession. He never told me. Some men keep their good deeds quiet, Running Elk said. I have watched over your cabin from afar since his passing, out of respect. Sarah's cries grew more insistent. With trembling hands, Margaret reached for little Fawn. The baby felt too light, too fragile in her arms. Without further hesitation, she sat in the rocking chair and positioned both infants to nurse. Until spring, she agreed, her voice quiet but firm. We will help each other survive this winter. As little Fawn began to nurse, her tiny hand gripped Margaret's finger with surprising strength. Outside, the winter wind continued to howl, but inside the cabin an unlikely peace had been established. Fragile as a newborn's grip, yet perhaps strong enough to withstand the harsh season ahead. 2 weeks passed since the unusual arrangement began. Each morning, Running Elk would arrive at the cabin, sometimes alone, sometimes with his friend Swift Arrow. True to his word, he never came empty-handed. Rabbit, deer, wild turkey, and once even a small bear provided meat for their table. Margaret had nearly forgotten the taste of fresh meat, and James's hollow cheeks had begun to fill out. The February morning dawned with a rare clear sky, as Running Elk taught James how to carve a small bow from a flexible branch of ash wood. The boy sat cross-legged on the cabin porch, his face a mask of concentration, as his small fingers worked the wood with a knife that seemed too large for his hands. Patience, young one, Running Elk advised, adjusting James's grip. The bow must know your hands as you know its wood. Inside the cabin, Margaret hummed softly as she nursed both babies. Little Fawn had gained weight, her copper skin taking on a healthier glow. Sarah, no longer constantly hungry, had become a happier baby, cooing and grabbing at Margaret's hair. Sometimes Margaret caught herself forgetting which child was born to her, and which had come to her through this strange twist of fate. Your milk has given my daughter strength, Running Elk said as he entered the cabin, leaving James to practice his carving. The spirits were wise to bring us together. Margaret nodded, adjusting little Fawn at her breast. She's a good baby. Hardly cries at all now. A comfortable silence fell between them, something that would have seemed impossible weeks ago. Margaret had begun to learn a few words of Comanche, and Running Elk's English improved daily. They had developed a routine of sorts. He would teach James in the mornings, hunt in the afternoons, and sometimes stay for the evening meal before returning to his camp a few miles away. The settlers in town? Margaret said hesitantly, breaking the silence. They wouldn't understand this arrangement. Running Elk's face darkened. My people would not understand either. There's too much blood between us. Yet here we are, Margaret said softly. Here we are, he agreed, his normally stern expression softening slightly. The walls between people are made by fear and memory. Children know nothing of these walls. As if to illustrate his point, Sarah reached out a tiny hand toward little Fawn, their fingers briefly touching as they nursed. Later that afternoon, while the babies slept, Margaret stepped outside to find James proudly holding a small, perfectly carved bow. His face glowed with pride as he showed her his first successful shot, a stick embedded in a tree trunk 20 paces away. Ma, did you see? I did it just like Running Elk showed me. I see, James. You're learning quickly. Margaret smiled, though her heart ached a little. Her son was growing up without his father, learning from a man who, just months ago, would have been considered an enemy. Running Elk approached from the tree line, a string of rabbits in his hand. The boy has good eyes and steady hands, he said, like his father. That evening, as they ate rabbit stew around the fire, James peppered Running Elk with questions about Comanche life, how they tracked animals, how they survived winter storms, how they found their way across the vast plains. Do you miss your village? James asked innocently. A shadow crossed Running Elk's face. My people move with the season. My band is camped not far, but I keep distance. Some warriors do not approve of my friendship with white settlers. Are you in danger because of us? Margaret asked, suddenly concerned. Running Elk met her gaze steadily. Life always holds danger. I choose my path as you choose yours. The simple statement hung in the air between them. Margaret realized how little she knew about the risks he was taking to help them. Tell me about your wife, she said quietly, after James had gone to bed. Running Elk's eyes reflected the firelight as he stared into the flames. Morning Flower was daughter of a medicine man. She knew plants that heal, songs that ease pain. She died bringing little Fawn into the world. I'm sorry, Margaret whispered, understanding the depth of his loss. Your husband, Running Elk asked in return. How did he truly die? Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she set down her cup. It wasn't just a hunting accident. There was a dispute with another settler over our land boundary. Thomas was shot in the back while tracking a deer. The man claimed he mistook Thomas for a bear. Her voice hardened. No one questioned his story much. The sheriff is his cousin. Running Elk nodded slowly. This man, he still lives nearby. Nathan Becker. His property borders ours to the east. He's wanted our spring since we arrived. Margaret sighed. With Thomas gone, he probably thinks I'll give up and leave come spring. Will you? Running Elk's question was direct, his dark eyes searching hers. Margaret looked around the small cabin that she and Thomas had built with their own hands. This is our home. James was born here. I won't be driven out. A rare smile crossed Running Elk's face. You have a warrior's heart, Margaret Wilson. The next morning brought heavy clouds and the threat of snow. Running Elk arrived earlier than usual, his expression grim. Riders coming, he said without preamble. 4 men from town. Margaret's heart sank. How long do we have? 1 hour, maybe less. I must not be seen here. He handed her a package wrapped in deerskin. Meat for 3 days. I will return when it is safe. As he turned to leave, Margaret caught his arm. Running Elk, thank you for everything. He nodded once, then knelt to speak to James. Remember what I taught you, young warrior. Protect your mother and the little ones. James stood straighter, his chin lifted in a gesture that reminded Margaret painfully of Thomas. I will. After Running Elk disappeared into the trees, Margaret quickly set about removing any trace of his presence. She was just finishing when she heard hoofbeats approaching. 4 men rode into the yard, led by Nathan Becker, a tall man with cold eyes and a perpetual sneer. Mrs. Wilson, he called, not bothering to dismount. We've come to check on you, being neighborly and all. Folks in town are concerned about a widow and children out here alone. Margaret stepped onto the porch, keeping her face neutral. We're doing just fine, Mr. Becker. Thank you for your concern. Becker's eyes narrowed as he scanned the property. Been noticing some strange tracks around these parts. Comanche, by the look of them. You haven't had any trouble, have you? No trouble at all, Margaret replied evenly. We keep to ourselves. One of the other men, whom Margaret recognized as the general store owner, spoke up. Mrs. Wilson, it might be safer for you and the children in town until spring. The Hendersons have a room they'd rent you cheap. That's very kind, but this is our home. We're staying. Becker dismounted and approached the porch, his boots heavy on the wooden steps. Being stubborn won't keep you safe, Margaret. These savages would think nothing of taking your scalp and stealing your children. He lowered his voice. Thomas isn't here to protect you anymore. The threat in his words was unmistakable. Margaret stood her ground, though her heart hammered in her chest. I believe you've delivered your message, Mr. Becker. Now, if you'll excuse me, my daughter needs attending to. Becker's face darkened, but he stepped back. Think about my offer for the property, Margaret. It stands until the first day of spring. After that, he shrugged. Well, this land isn't much good without protection. As the men rode away, Margaret caught James watching from the window, his small face tight with anger. Is Mr. Becker the one who hurt Pa? He asked. Margaret pulled him close. We don't know that for certain, James. Running Elk says a man's eyes tell his true thoughts. Mr. Becker has bad eyes, Ma. Margaret couldn't disagree. As the riders disappeared down the trail, she wondered how long they had until the next visit, and whether Running Elk would truly return after the risk of discovery had increased. That night, as a snowstorm howled around the cabin, Margaret sat by the fire nursing the babies. Little Fawn's dark eyes, so serious for an infant, watched Margaret's face as she fed. Sarah had already fallen asleep at her breast. What will become of us all when spring comes? Margaret whispered to the sleeping cabin. The question hung in the air, unanswered except by the crackling of the fire and the endless moaning of the winter wind. March arrived with the first tentative signs of spring. The snow began to melt, revealing patches of mud and the occasional brave green shoot. Despite the increasing danger, Running Elk continued to visit the cabin, though more cautiously now, always approaching from different directions and never staying past nightfall. Margaret found herself watching for his arrival each day, a warmth spreading through her chest whenever she caught sight of his tall figure emerging from the trees. James had taken to running to meet him, proudly showing off new skills he'd practiced in Running Elk's absence. One mild afternoon, as Margaret hung laundry on the line with little Fawn secured to her chest in a cradleboard Running Elk had made, she heard James's excited voice from the edge of the clearing. "Ma, look what I caught." James raced toward her, Running Elk walking steadily behind him. In her son's hands was a rabbit, already dressed and ready for cooking. "His first kill," Running Elk explained, undisguised pride in his voice. "He tracked it himself and made a clean shot." James beamed, standing taller than Margaret had ever seen him. "I remembered everything you taught me. I was quiet as a shadow, patient as a mountain." Margaret hugged her son, swallowing the lump in her throat. "Your father would be so proud of you, James. Running Elk says we should celebrate with a special meal," James continued excitedly. "He brought sweet roots and berries he's been saving." That evening, they shared a feast around the fire pit outside the cabin. The early spring air still carried a chill, but the sky was clear, stars emerging one by one as darkness fell. Both babies lay contentedly in their cradles nearby, having nursed until their tiny stomachs were round and full. "In my people's way," Running Elk said as they finished eating, "a boy's first hunt is an important step toward manhood. There would be songs and stories told by the elders." James looked up eagerly. "Will you tell me a story? About when you were a boy?" Running Elk's usually stern face softened. "When I was no taller than you, my grandfather took me to hunt buffalo. It was summer, the grass tall as a man's waist. We followed the herd for 3 days before finding the right moment to strike." Margaret listened as Running Elk's deep voice painted pictures of vast prairies, thundering herds, and ancient traditions. James sat transfixed, absorbing every word. In that moment, the differences between them, settler and Comanche, white and native, seemed to fade into insignificance against the timeless bond of a man teaching a boy. Later, after James had fallen asleep beside the dying fire, Margaret and Running Elk sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars. "Your son grows strong," Running Elk finally said. "He has his father's courage and your determination." "He admires you greatly," Margaret replied. "I've never seen him so alive." Running Elk nodded, his profile sharp against the night sky. "And little Fawn thrives with your care. Her spirit grows stronger each day." The unspoken question hung between them. What would happen when spring fully arrived? Their arrangement had been until spring, but now that time was approaching, neither seemed eager to address it. "Nathan Becker came by again yesterday," Margaret said, changing the subject. "He's offered to buy the land again. Says it's not safe for us out here alone." Running Elk's face hardened. "This man threatens without speaking threats. He said his offer expires at the spring equinox, about 2 weeks from now." Margaret stared into the embers. After that, he implied that accidents might happen. "This is your home," Running Elk stated firmly. "The land where your husband rests, where your children have roots." "Yes," Margaret agreed simply. "But I'm afraid, Running Elk. Not for myself, but for the children." Running Elk was silent for a long moment. "Among my people, when a warrior dies, his brother sometimes takes his place, caring for his family, honoring his memory." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. "Thomas had no brother." "He called me brother once," Running Elk said quietly, "when he found me wounded and did not take my scalp as others would." Their eyes met across the dying fire, and Margaret felt something shift between them, something unspoken but powerful. "What are you suggesting?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Before Running Elk could answer, a cry came from one of the cradles. Margaret rose quickly to check on the babies the moment broken. The next day, Running Elk arrived with troubling news. "Riders have been following my trail. They search the area more carefully now." Margaret's stomach knotted with fear. "Is it safe for you to be here?" "No place is truly safe," he replied. But I have made a decision. I will move my camp closer, hidden in the rocks by the North Creek. I can watch over you better from there." "That's too dangerous," Margaret protested. "If they find you, if I leave, Becker will move against you," Running Elk interrupted. "I have seen men like him before. He believes you are alone and defenseless. But I can't ask you to risk your life for us." Running Elk's dark eyes held hers steadily. "You did not ask. I choose this path." That night, as Margaret lay awake listening to the baby's soft breathing, she found herself contemplating a future she had never imagined. Could they continue this way? A white widow and a Comanche warrior, raising children together? The very idea defied everything she had been taught. Yet over these winter months, Running Elk had become essential to their survival, and perhaps to more than that. The next morning dawned clear and unusually warm. Margaret woke to find James already outside, practicing with his bow. The sight of her son, moving with a new confidence and purpose, brought tears to her eyes. Thomas would hardly recognize the boy who had grown so much in these few months. As she prepared breakfast, Margaret heard James call out a greeting. Through the window, she saw Running Elk approaching, his expression more serious than usual. When he entered the cabin, she knew immediately something was wrong. "Becker and 6 men ride this way," he said without preamble. "They carry weapons for more than hunting." Margaret's blood ran cold. "How long do we have?" "Less than an hour. I saw them from the ridge." He looked around the cabin quickly. "You must take the children and go to the cave we found by the creek. I will deal with these men." "No," Margaret exclaimed. "They'll kill you. There are too many." Running Elk's face was set in determined lines. "I will not fight unless forced, but I must protect what is mine." The words hung in the air between them. What is mine? Not just Little Fawn, but all of them. This makeshift family they had created. "We'll face them together," Margaret said firmly. "This is our home. I won't be driven from it by fear." For a moment, Running Elk looked as though he would argue, but then he nodded slowly. "Very well. But the children must be safe first." Together, they quickly gathered supplies: food, blankets, water. Margaret wrapped both babies securely, trying to keep them calm despite her own racing heart. James, sensing the urgency, moved quickly and without question, gathering his bow and the small knife Running Elk had given him. "Take them to the cave," Running Elk instructed James. "Stay hidden until your mother or I come for you. Protect the little ones." James nodded solemnly, his young face suddenly looking much older. "I will, like you taught me." Margaret embraced her son fiercely, then kissed each baby. "Be brave, my loves. We'll come for you soon." As James disappeared into the trees, carrying Sarah while Margaret secured Little Fawn in the cradleboard on his back, she felt as though her heart was being torn in two. Every instinct screamed to go with them, to protect her children, but she knew that facing Becker now might be their only chance to keep their home. Running Elk stood beside her on the porch as the sound of approaching horses grew louder. His presence was solid, reassuring. "Whatever happens," he said quietly, "know that these months have been a good path for my spirit." Margaret reached for his hand, her fingers intertwining with his, and mine. Together they watched as Becker and his men rode into the clearing, their faces set with grim purpose, their rifles gleaming in the spring sunlight. Nathan Becker's face contorted with rage when he saw Running Elk standing beside Margaret on the porch. The other men immediately raised their rifles, pointing them directly at the Comanche warrior. "Step away from that savage, Mrs. Wilson," Becker called out, his voice hard with command. Margaret stood her ground, her shoulder nearly touching Running Elk's. "Mr. Becker, this man is my guest. You and your men are trespassing on my property." A murmur ran through the group of riders. One of them, the blacksmith from town, spoke up uncertainly. "Mrs. Wilson, are you being held against your will? Blink twice if you can't speak freely." "I am perfectly free, Mr. Henderson," Margaret replied calmly. "Running Elk has been helping me and my children survive the winter after my husband's death." Becker sneered, dismounting from his horse and taking a step forward. "So the rumors are true. Living with a Comanche, letting him into your home." His eyes narrowed as he looked around. "Where are the children? What have you done with them?" "They are safe," Margaret said firmly. "Away from men who come to our home armed and threatening." "This is unnatural," Becker spat. A white woman consorting with a savage. The whole territory will hear of this disgrace. Running Elk remained perfectly still, his face impassive, though Margaret could sense the tension in his body. He was poised to move at the slightest provocation, like a mountain lion ready to pounce. "What's disgraceful," Margaret said, her voice rising with newfound courage, "is threatening a widow and her children to steal their land. What's disgraceful is shooting a man in the back and claiming it was an accident." A stunned silence fell over the group. Several of the men exchanged uncomfortable glances. "What are you implying, Mrs. Wilson?" the sheriff asked, speaking for the first time. "I'm not implying anything, Sheriff Davis. I'm stating plainly that Nathan Becker murdered my husband to get this land, and now he's come to finish what he started." Becker's face flushed deep red. "That's a damned lie. Thomas Wilson died in a hunting accident. Everyone knows that." "Everyone knows you wanted our spring," Margaret countered. "Everyone knows you threatened Thomas repeatedly before he died." The sheriff looked uncertain now, glancing between Margaret and Becker. "These are serious accusations, Mrs. Wilson." "And I have proof," Running Elk said suddenly, his deep voice carrying across the yard. He reached slowly into his pouch, movements deliberate to avoid alarming the armed men. From it he withdrew a tarnished bullet and a scrap of fabric. "This bullet I removed from Thomas Wilson's body when I found him dying. It matches the rifle that man carries." He pointed at Becker. "This cloth was caught on a branch near where the shot was fired. It matches his coat." The sheriff dismounted, approaching cautiously to examine the items. "How did you come to find Thomas Wilson?" "I watched this man follow him into the forest," Running Elk explained. "I saw him raise his rifle and shoot when Thomas's back was turned. I found Thomas still breathing, but the wound was too great. He asked me to watch over his family." Margaret stared at Running Elk in shock. He had never told her this, that he had been with Thomas in his final moments. "He's lying," Becker shouted, his hand moving toward his gun. "You'd take the word of a savage over a white man?" "I'd take the word of an honest man over a dishonest one," the sheriff replied slowly, his eyes now fixed on Becker with new suspicion. "That bullet looks like it's from your Henry rifle, Nathan, and that fabric does match your coat." "This is absurd," Becker sputtered, but his confidence was clearly shaken. "You can't possibly believe Thomas's last words," Running Elk interrupted, his gaze steady on Becker. He said, "Tell Margaret it was Becker, by the lightning oak. The tree where you shot him has a lightning scar down its trunk. The bullet passed through Thomas and embedded in that tree. It can still be found there." The sheriff's expression hardened. "Nathan, I think you'd better come back to town with me. We have some questions that need answering." "The hell I will." Becker suddenly drew his pistol, aiming it directly at Running Elk. "I'll finish what I started with this savage." Everything happened in an instant. Margaret threw herself in front of Running Elk just as Becker fired. The bullet whistled past her ear as Running Elk pulled her down to the porch floor, covering her body with his own. The sheriff and another man tackled Becker, wrestling him to the ground as his gun discharged again into the air. "Are you hurt?" Running Elk asked urgently, his hands moving over Margaret's arms and shoulders, checking for injuries. "No," she gasped, her heart pounding wildly. "I'm all right." When they stood, Becker was face down on the ground, the sheriff binding his wrists with a leather strap. The other men looked on in stunned silence, their rifles now lowered. "Mrs. Wilson, I owe you an apology," the sheriff said grimly. "It seems we've all been blind to what's been happening here." He glanced at Running Elk with newfound respect. "And to you as well, sir. You've shown more honor than many men I know." As the men prepared to take Becker back to town to face justice, the blacksmith approached Margaret hesitantly. "Mrs. Wilson, about your arrangement here, it's unusual, but I want you to know that my family will stand by you. Thomas was a good man, and he'd be grateful his family was cared for." One by one, the other men nodded their agreement, though some still looked uncomfortable with the situation. "The children," Margaret said suddenly, remembering James and the babies. "We need to bring them home." Running Elk nodded. "I will go. They are not far." As he disappeared into the trees, the sheriff approached Margaret again. "Mrs. Wilson, I won't pretend this won't cause talk in town. A white woman and a Comanche. It's not something folks around here are used to." "I'm not asking for anyone's approval, Sheriff," Margaret replied steadily. "Only for the right to live in peace on our land." The sheriff nodded slowly. Well, you've earned that much at least. I'll do what I can to make sure folks understand the truth of what happened here. By the time the men rode away with Becker in tow, the sun was beginning to set. Margaret stood on the porch, watching the trail long after they had disappeared from sight. When she heard footsteps behind her, she turned to see Running Elk returning with James and the babies. James ran to his mother, throwing his arms around her waist. "I did just like Running Elk said, Ma. I kept them safe." "You were very brave," Margaret said, hugging him tightly. She took Sarah from his arms while Running Elk gently lifted little Fawn from the cradleboard. That evening, as the children slept peacefully inside, Margaret and Running Elk sat on the porch steps, watching the first stars appear. "Why didn't you tell me?" Margaret asked softly. "About being with Thomas when he died?" Running Elk was silent for a moment. "At first I did not think you would believe me. Later I did not wish to bring more pain." Margaret nodded, understanding. "What happens now?" "Spring is here. Now we choose our path." Running Elk replied simply. "My daughter needs a mother. Your son needs a father. The land needs tending. It won't be easy," Margaret said, thinking of the townspeople's reactions, the challenges they would face. Two different worlds. "Not so different," Running Elk countered. "We both know love, loss, hope. We both want our children to grow strong and free." Margaret looked at him, really looked at him, this man who had become so essential to their survival, to their happiness. "Are you asking to stay? Permanently?" "I am asking if we can make a new way together," he said, his dark eyes serious in the fading light. "Not your way or my way, but our way." Inside the cabin, one of the babies began to cry. Margaret stood, offering her hand to Running Elk. "Let's find out," she said. As they walked inside together, Margaret felt a sense of rightness settle over her. The path ahead would not be easy, but they would walk it together. A family forged not by blood or tradition, but by choice and necessity, and perhaps by love. 1 year later, the cabin had expanded to include a new room and a larger porch. The garden flourished with both traditional crops and native plants that Running Elk had taught Margaret to cultivate. James, now 6, spent his days learning both his letters from Margaret and the ways of the land from Running Elk. Sarah and little Fawn, inseparable as